My father-in-law leaned over the incubator, looked at my daughter's tiny chest rising and falling under the ventilator tape, and said the words I will hear until the day I die: "She's not worth the money it's going to cost to save her." My wife's hand went cold in mine. The monitor beeped twice, faster, like even the machine was offended. "I want you to understand something before I go any further. That man is a grandfather. That was his own granddaughter he was talking about. 2 pounds 1 ounce, 12 weeks early, fighting for every single breath in a plastic box under fluorescent lights, and in that moment, standing in an ICU hallway that smelled like hand sanitizer and fear. I made a promise to myself that I never once said out loud. I promised that one day, Richard Colton was going to understand exactly what his granddaughter was worth. My name is Mark Halloway. I was 31 years old the night my daughter Grace decided she couldn't wait any longer to meet the world. I ran a small transmission shop outside of Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place with a bell over the door and a coffee pot that never turned off. My wife, Sarah, was the love of my life since we were 19 years old, working the same summer job at a lake resort where I fixed golf carts and she ran a snack bar. She grew up different than me. Her family had money, old money, new attitude, the kind of wealth that comes with strings attached to every single dollar. Sarah's father, Richard Colton, built a regional trucking and logistics company from nothing back in the 80s, and he never let anyone forget it. Her mother, Diane, was quieter, the kind of quiet that comes from 30 years of learning when to speak and when to disappear into a room. When Sarah told her parents she was marrying a mechanic instead of the hedge fund associate they'd been grooming for her since high school, Richard didn't come to the engagement dinner. He sent a card. It said, "Congratulations, I suppose." We got married anyway, in a backyard with string lights and a barbecue instead of a country club. Richard showed up for 20 minutes, shook my hand like he was checking my grip strength, and left before the toasts. Diane cried at the ceremony, but I never knew if it was happiness or something else. I would find out years later exactly what those tears meant. Sarah got pregnant 2 years into our marriage, and for a while, everything in our life felt like it was finally clicking into place. We painted a nursery yellow because we wanted to be surprised. We picked out a crib from a garage sale and I refinished it myself in the shop after hours, sanding down 30 years of someone else's memories to make room for ours. At 28 weeks, Sarah woke up at 3 in the morning with a pain that made her curl into herself on the bathroom floor. I drove 90 miles an hour to the hospital with my hazards on, running to red lights, praying to a God I hadn't talked to since my own mother's funeral. By the time we got there, Sarah was already fully dilated. There was no stopping it. Our daughter was coming, 12 weeks too soon, and there was nothing anyone could do to slow her down. Grace Colton Halloway was born at 5:47 in the morning, weighing 2 pounds and 1 ounce, small enough to fit in the palm of my 2 hands with room to spare. She didn't cry when she was born. The room went silent except for a nurse calling out numbers, and then the smallest, the most fragile sound I have ever heard in my life. A whimper like a kitten, and I broke down sobbing right there in a hospital hallway in my socks because I'd forgotten to put my shoes back on. They rushed her to the NICU before I even got to hold her. Sarah was still on the table, pale and shaking, asking through tears if our daughter was going to live. Nobody could give her an answer, not yet, not for a long time. I called Richard and Diane from the hospital parking lot at 6 in the morning, my hands shaking so bad I dropped the phone twice. Diane picked up crying before I even said a word, like she already knew. Richard got on the line a minute later, his voice flat and businesslike, asking me one question: "What are the odds?" Not "Is she okay?" Not "Is Sarah okay?" What are the odds? They drove up from Cincinnati that same afternoon, and Richard walked into that NICU in a 3-piece suit like he had a board meeting to get to after visiting his dying granddaughter. He looked at Grace through the plastic of the incubator for maybe 10 seconds, then he turned to me, in front of Sarah, in front of the nurses, and said those words that changed everything between us forever: "She's not worth the money it's going to cost to save her." I wanted to put my fist through the nearest wall, but Sarah grabbed my arm, hard, her nails digging into my skin, silently begging me not to make a scene in the one place our daughter needed peace the most. So I said nothing. I swallowed every single word. I wanted to scream at that man and I let it settle in my chest like a stone I would carry for years. Diane didn't say anything either. She just stood there with tears streaming down her face, looking at her husband like she wanted to disappear into the linoleum floor. I noticed something in that moment I wouldn't understand the full weight of until much later. Diane wasn't just sad, she looked afraid. Grace spent the next 4 months in that ICU, for months of monitors and alarms and doctors using words like intraventricular hemorrhage and necrotizing enterocolitis that I had to look up on my phone in the hospital cafeteria because I was too embarrassed to ask what they meant. Twice, for months of Sarah pumping breast milk in a closet-sized room at 3 in the morning because it was the only thing she could physically do to help her own daughter survive. The bills started arriving before Grace was even a month old. Our insurance covered a portion, but even a portion of a 4-month ICU stay for a micro preemie is the kind of number that makes your stomach drop when you open the envelope. I picked up extra jobs on the weekends, transmission work for 2 other shops, anything with a paycheck attached. I stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. I started skipping meals so I wouldn't have to think about grocery bills on top of everything else. Richard never offered a dollar. Not one single dollar. A man who owned 40% of a trucking company worth 11 figures on paper let his own daughter and granddaughter drown in medical debt without lifting a finger. When Sarah finally worked up the courage to ask him for help 3 weeks after Grace was born, he told her that throwing money at a bad situation doesn't fix it, it just delays the inevitable. I remember Sarah hanging up that phone call and sliding down our kitchen wall until she was sitting on the floor, sobbing so hard she couldn't catch her breath. I sat down next to her and held her, and in that moment I realized something that would define the next several years of my life. We were completely on our own, and somehow, that made me love her more fiercely than I ever had before. Grace came home in February, weighing 5 pounds, still on a heart monitor, still needing oxygen support through a tiny nasal cannula that made her look like the bravest little astronaut in the world. We turned our dining room into a makeshift medical station, alarms and tubing and a rotation of home nurse visits. Richard and Diane came to see her exactly once in the first 6 months she was home. Richard spent most of the visit on his phone. I want to be honest with you here, because that's the only way I know how to tell this story. There were nights during that first year I genuinely hated that man. Not disliked, hated, the kind of hate that keeps you staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning replaying the moment he said those words over and over, sharpening them like a knife you can't put down. But hate is expensive, and I had a daughter who needed every ounce of energy I had left over after 12-hour shifts, so I buried it. I put it in a box in the back of my mind, and I focused on the only thing that mattered, which was keeping Grace alive and keeping Sarah from falling apart. Be honest with me for a second, would you ever forgive your own family after something like this? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments, because I still don't have a clean answer for myself, even after everything that came later. Grace turned 1 year old in a hospital gown, because she'd been readmitted for a respiratory infection that sent her back to the ICU for 11 terrifying days. Richard sent a card again. It said, "Hope she pulls through," not "happy birthday," not "I love her," "hope she pulls through," like she was a business quarter he was cautiously optimistic about. Diane came alone that time, sneaking away from a family trip to Richard's lake house without telling him. She sat in the hospital room and held Grace's tiny hand and cried for almost an hour without saying much of anything. Before she left, she squeezed my hand and said something strange. "Marka, there are things about Richard you don't know. Things that would explain some of this, if not excuse it." I asked her what she meant. She just shook her head and said, "Not yet, not until I'm braver." I didn't understand that conversation for almost 6 years. I want you to hold on to it though, because it matters more than you know right now. By the time Grace turned 2, she was defying almost every prediction the doctors had made in that ICU. She had some developmental delays, a mild vision issue from her prematurity, and a stubbornness that Sarah swore came straight from my side of the family. She also had the loudest and most contagious laugh I have ever heard from a human being, and every single time I heard it, I thought about Richard standing over her incubator saying she wasn't worth saving. Our finances were a disaster. We'd taken out a second mortgage on our house to cover the medical debt that insurance hadn't touched. My shop was barely staying afloat because I'd been too distracted, too exhausted, too stretched thin to grow the business the way it needed. Sarah had quit her job to care for Grace full-time, which meant we were living on one income that was shrinking instead of growing. That's when the letter from a law firm in Cincinnati showed up in our mailbox, and everything started to shift in ways I never could have predicted. The letter was from a firm representing the Colton Family Trust, informing Sarah that as a beneficiary, she was entitled to periodic distributions from a fund her own grandmother had established decades earlier, specifically earmarked for medical emergencies affecting Colton descendants. Sarah had never even known this trust existed. Richard had never mentioned it, not once. Not during 4 months of NICU bills, not during a second mortgage, not during a single sleepless night. We called the number on the letter with our hands shaking, half convinced it was some kind of scam. It wasn't. A trust officer named Patricia Ruiz explained that Sarah's grandmother, a woman named Eleanor Colton who died when Sarah was only 6 years old, had set aside nearly $2 million specifically for medical emergencies affecting her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The trust had been quietly sitting there, accumulating interest, completely untouched, for over a decade. Patricia mentioned something odd during that call, almost in passing. She said Richard, as the trust's co-trustee, had filed paperwork 3 separate times over the past year attempting to have the medical emergency clause removed from the trust entirely. Each time, the trust's independent oversight committee had rejected his request, citing Eleanor's explicit and unambiguous instructions. I remember sitting at our kitchen table with the phone on speaker, looking at Sarah's face drain of color. Her own father had tried, 3 separate times, to erase the exact provision that would have saved us from drowning in debt. At the exact moment we needed it most, that wasn't neglect anymore, that was something closer to sabotage. Sarah called her mother that night, furious, demanding answers. Diane didn't defend Richard, she didn't even try. All she said was, "I begged him not to do that. I want you to know I begged him." And then she said something that has stuck with me for years. "Your father has spent 30 years trying to bury something, Sarah. And I think Grace being born the way she was cracked something open in him that he can't control." We didn't understand what that meant yet, but the trust distribution came through 6 weeks later, and it changed our lives. We paid off the second mortgage, we caught up on every single medical bill for the first time in 2 years. I slept through an entire night without waking up in a cold sweat calculating numbers in my head. Richard found out the distribution had gone through, and instead of being relieved that his own granddaughter's medical debt was finally handled, he was furious. He called Sarah screaming, according to her, accusing us of manipulating a dead woman's charity for our own benefit, which made absolutely no sense given that Eleanor herself had written the provision decades before Grace was ever born. That phone call was the first time Sarah truly saw her father clearly, not as a difficult man, not as someone with old-fashioned values about money, but as someone actively working against his own family's well-being for reasons neither of us understood yet. She hung up on him for the first time in her life. She was shaking when she told me about it, but underneath the shaking, I saw something else: relief. Grace started preschool at 3 years old, tiny for her age but sharp as anything, already reading simple words that her occupational therapist said were well ahead of schedule for a child with her history. Every single milestone she hit felt like a small, quiet middle finger to a man who had looked at her in an incubator and calculated her not worth saving. It was around this time that Diane started calling me directly, instead of going through Sarah. She said she trusted me to hear things clearly without the emotional weight that came with hearing them from a daughter. The first time she called, she asked if she could take Grace to the park alone sometime, just the 2 of them. I said, yes, cautiously, and something about that day would matter more than I understood at the time. When Diane brought Grace home that afternoon, she stayed in the driveway for almost 20 minutes, sitting in her car. Before she finally came inside, her eyes were red. She told Sarah and me that she needed to tell us something, but she wasn't ready, and she needed us to be patient with her a little longer. We had no idea what she was carrying. We would find out soon enough. Richard's trucking company hit turbulence that same year, a combination of rising fuel costs and a major contract loss with a national retailer that had been their biggest client for over a decade. For a man whose entire identity was built around being the smartest guy in every room, watching his company's value slide on paper was something close to an existential crisis, and it made him meaner to Diane, meaner to Sarah, meaner, somehow, even from a distance, to us. That's when the second letter arrived, not from the trust this time, but from Richard's personal attorney, informing Sarah that Richard was formally excluding her, and by extension Grace, from his personal estate plan, citing what the letter called irreconcilable differences in family values to $1 million from a dead grandmother's. Trust had been given freely by a woman we never even got to know, and her own son was now trying to erase Sarah completely from his will as punishment for accepting it. Sarah read that letter standing in our kitchen, and I watched something in her break and rebuild itself at the exact same time. She wasn't crying anymore. She looked at me and said, very calmly, I don't want his money, Mark. I never did. I want to know why he hates his own granddaughter enough to do this. I told her I didn't know, but I also told her that I intended to find out, one way or another. Grace turned 4, then 5, growing into a bright, curious, occasionally fierce little girl who loved dinosaurs and asking but why approximately 400 times a day. Her lung function had improved dramatically, though she still carried a rescue inhaler everywhere. Her vision issue required glasses that she insisted on decorating with dinosaur stickers, refusing to take them off even at bath time. She had absolutely no idea that a grandfather existed who had once decided she wasn't worth the cost of saving. It was Diane who finally broke. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late October, sitting across from us at our kitchen table with a manila folder clutched against her chest like it might combust if she let go of it, she said she had been carrying this secret for 34 years, and that watching Richard treat Grace the way he did had made it impossible to keep carrying it silently any longer. Inside that folder was a birth certificate for a baby boy named Thomas Colton, born 36 years earlier, 3 months premature, weighing barely 2 pounds, Richard's first child, a son none of us had ever heard mentioned, not once, in over a decade of family gatherings, arguments, and holidays. Diane's hands were shaking as she explained it. Before Richard married her, he'd had a brief first marriage in his early 20s to a woman named Carol. Carol gave birth prematurely to their son Thomas, and the medical costs, combined with a lengthy and difficult recovery for the baby, drained the young couple's finances completely. Richard, only 23 years old at the time, panicked under the weight of hospital bills he had no way to pay and a wife who blamed him for not being able to provide. Thomas lived, but he was left with significant developmental disabilities from complications during that premature birth. Richard, ashamed and financially devastated and utterly unequipped to handle it, made a decision at 24 years old that he would spend the rest of his life trying to bury. He signed away his parental rights. He let Carol's new husband adopt Thomas 2 years later, and he never saw his own son again. Diane said she only learned about Thomas 6 years into her marriage to Richard, when a letter arrived from Carol asking if Richard wanted any contact as Thomas turned 18. Richard burned the letter in their fireplace without responding. Diane said watching him do that was the first time she truly understood what kind of fear lived underneath her husband's cold exterior. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was a man who had made an unforgivable choice once, and had spent every day since trying to convince himself, and everyone around him, that saving a premature baby wasn't worth the sacrifice, because if it was worth it, then what he'd done to Thomas made him a monster. I sat there in my kitchen absorbing all of this, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 5 years finally loosened, just slightly. Richard wasn't standing over Grace's incubator calculating some cold business decision about our family specifically. He was staring at a mirror of the worst moment of his own life, and instead of facing it, he tried to make our daughter's survival about money, the same excuse he'd used on himself for over 3 decades. That doesn't excuse what he said. Nothing excuses what he said. Standing over a 2-pound baby, telling her father she wasn't worth saving, but it explained it, and for Sarah, understanding where that cruelty came from didn't erase the anger. If anything, it gave her something sharper to work with. Sarah asked Diane one question. Did Thomas ever know that Richard regretted it? Diane said she didn't know, because she had never once, in 30 years of marriage, been allowed to speak Thomas's name in their house. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? Share your story below because I'd love to read it. Because what came next in our family was a betrayal I never saw coming from the one direction I never expected it. Sarah, quietly and without telling anyone including me at first, hired a private investigator to locate Thomas Colton. It took the investigator less than 3 weeks. Thomas, it turned out, was living in Columbus, Ohio, less than 2 hours from us, working as a woodshop teacher at a vocational high school. He'd had a good life, all things considered, raised by loving adoptive parents who had since passed away, and he had zero idea that his biological father was a wealthy trucking magnate who had spent 36 years pretending he never existed. Sarah met Thomas for coffee on a Saturday morning in November, telling him only that she believed they might be related through a complicated family situation. She said Thomas was kind, soft-spoken, funny in an understated way, and that within 20 minutes of talking, she could see traces of her own father's face in his expressions, which she said was one of the strangest feelings of her entire life. When Sarah finally told Thomas the full truth, about Richard, about Carol, about the adoption, about 36 years of silence, Thomas didn't get angry the way she expected. He got quiet. He said he'd always wondered, but had made peace with not knowing a long time ago, because chasing answers from someone who clearly didn't want to be found felt like begging for scraps he didn't need. Sarah asked him one final question before they parted ways that day. Would he ever want to meet Richard? If the opportunity somehow presented itself. Thomas thought about it for a long time before answering. He said he didn't need an apology to feel whole, but if Richard ever wanted to give one, he wouldn't refuse to hear it. That conversation planted something in Sarah's mind that would take root over the following months. Not revenge in the traditional sense, not the kind involving screaming matches or public humiliation, but something more patient, more precise, and ultimately far more powerful. Meanwhile, Richard's business troubles had deepened. The fuel cost crisis combined with the lost retail contract had pushed Colton Logistics into a position where the board was actively discussing whether Richard should remain CEO, a position he had held for nearly 4 decades. Richard, sensing the walls closing in professionally, became even more controlling at home, which meant even more distant and cold toward Diane, who by this point had started quietly visiting a therapist without telling him, and had started quietly visiting us more often, and had started quietly falling in love with her granddaughter in a way that felt like it was healing something old and buried in her. Grace turned 6 years old, and for her birthday, Diane showed up not with an expensive gift, but with a small wooden box she'd had custom-made, containing a handwritten letter for Grace to read when she was older, explaining everything, the trust, the estrangement, Thomas, all of it, so that Grace would never grow up not knowing the full truth of her own family the way Sarah and Thomas both had. Richard did not attend that birthday party. He hadn't attended any of them. It was around this time that I got a phone call that changed the entire trajectory of what happened next. It came from a man named Gerald Whitfield, Colton Logistics' longtime chief financial officer, who was retiring after 29 years with the company and had apparently decided, on his way out the door, that he was done staying silent about something that had been bothering him for years. Gerald told me, over coffee at a diner off I-Chiu, that Richard had been improperly using company funds for years, funneling money through a series of shell consulting contracts that ultimately routed back into his personal accounts, effectively embezzling from a company that was publicly traded and answerable to a board of shareholders. Gerald had documentation, years of it. He said he'd stayed quiet because he was scared of losing his pension, but retirement had freed him from that fear, and watching how Richard treated his own family over the years had finally pushed him past the point of staying silent. I asked Gerald why he was telling me this instead of Sarah. He said it was simple. He said Sarah still had too much emotional history with her father to think clearly about what to do with this information. But he'd watched me from a distance for years, at the handful of family gatherings Richard couldn't avoid, and he believed I was the one person in this family who would handle it with the right combination of patience and precision. I didn't act immediately. I want to be clear about that. Because intelligent revenge is never impulsive. I spent nearly 4 months quietly working with a forensic accountant, a friend of Gerald's, cross-referencing every document Gerald had provided against Colton Logistics' public shareholder filings. What we found was staggering. Over 9 years, Richard had diverted just over $1 million of company funds through fraudulent consulting arrangements, money that belonged to shareholders, to employees' pension contributions, to a company that thousands of families depended on for their livelihoods. Every single dollar of that money, every fraudulent contract, was documented with dates, amounts, and forged signatures that a handwriting expert later confirmed were not authentic. This wasn't gray area accounting, this was outright fraud, the kind that ends careers and sometimes ends in federal indictments. I brought everything to Sarah on a Sunday evening after Grace had gone to bed, laying it all out on our kitchen table, the same table where Diane had once confessed the truth about Thomas. Sarah went through every page in silence, her face unreadable, until she finally looked up at me and asked the only question that mattered: "What do you want to do with this?" I told her the truth. I wanted her father to face real consequences. Legal ones. Not just family estrangement he could hide behind a closed door and a locked wallet, but I also told her the decision had to be hers, because it was her father, her family name, her history on the line, and I wasn't going to make that choice for her. Sarah thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she said something I will never forget. She said, "He looked at our daughter in an incubator and decided she wasn't worth saving because of money." I want him to understand, in the most concrete way possible, exactly what he was willing to sacrifice everything for. Not power, not love, just money he didn't even need. We didn't go to the tabloids, we didn't post anything online, we didn't show up at his office and scream in front of his employees, tempting as that fantasy was on our worst nights. Instead, we did the one thing that would actually matter. We took everything to the SEC and to the Colton Logistics Board of Directors simultaneously, through an attorney Gerald recommended who specialized in corporate fraud whistleblower cases. The investigation moved faster than any of us expected. Within 6 weeks, the board placed Richard on administrative leave pending a full audit. Within 4 months, the SEC had opened a formal investigation. Within 7 months, Richard Colton, the man who once told me his granddaughter wasn't worth saving, was formally indicted on multiple counts of securities fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying corporate records. I won't pretend I didn't feel something complicated watching that unfold. Satisfaction, yes, but also a strange, unexpected sadness, watching a man's entire life's work collapse in real time, even a man who had caused so much pain to the people I loved most. Richard's trial lasted 11 days. Diane did not attend a single one of them, choosing instead to spend that time with us, with Grace, in our backyard, teaching her granddaughter how to plant tomatoes in a garden bed Diane built with her own 2 hands, a woman who had spent 30 years learning when to disappear, finally learning how to take up space of her own. The jury found Richard guilty on 5 of 7 counts. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, ordered to pay full restitution to Colton Logistics and its shareholders, and permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company for the rest of his life. The company itself survived or restructured under new leadership, and the pension funds Richard had quietly siphoned from were fully restored through the restitution order. I sat in that courtroom on the day of sentencing, not out of anger anymore, but because Sarah asked me to be there with her. When the judge read the sentence, Richard turned around in his seat and looked directly at us, at me, at Sarah, and for the first time in almost 7 years, I saw something in his face that wasn't cold or calculating. I saw a broken man finally understanding far too late exactly what he had thrown away chasing money he didn't even need. Diane filed for divorce 3 weeks after the sentencing. She said she'd stayed married to Richard for 31 years, partly out of loyalty and partly out of fear of what people would say. But watching her granddaughter thrive despite everything Richard had said about her worth finally gave Diane the courage to build a life that didn't require his approval to feel complete. 6 months after the sentencing, Sarah organized something that surprised even me, a small dinner at our house, with Diane, with Grace, and with Thomas Colton, the half-brother Sarah never knew existed until that manila folder appeared on our kitchen table. Thomas brought a woodworking project he'd made for Grace, a small hand-carved dinosaur, and watching this quiet, kind man meet his niece for the first time, watching Grace immediately demand he build her a whole collection of dinosaurs, something in that room felt like it was finally, genuinely healing. Richard is still serving out the remainder of his sentence as I'm telling you this story. He's written Sarah 3 letters from prison. She's read all 3, and she's answered none of them, not out of cruelty, but because she said she's not ready, and she refuses to force forgiveness before it's honestly earned. I think that's one of the wisest things I've ever heard anyone say. Grace is 9 years old now. She still has her glasses, still covered in dinosaur stickers because some things never change. Her lungs are strong enough that the inhaler mostly stays in a drawer these days. She's reading to grade levels ahead. She plays travel soccer, and she has absolutely no idea that a man once stood over her incubator and calculated whether she was worth the cost of saving. We'll tell her the full story one day, when she's old enough to understand all of it, the good and the painful parts both. Diane's wooden box with the letter is waiting for that exact day. Our transmission shop grew into 2 locations over these past few years, partly because I finally had the mental space to focus on building something instead of just surviving month to month. Sarah went back to school and became a pediatric occupational therapist, specifically choosing to work with premature infants and their families, because she said nobody understood the terror of that NICU hallway quite like someone who had actually lived it. I think about that night in the hospital parking lot sometimes, dialing Richard's number with shaking hands, so desperate for someone, anyone, to tell me my daughter was going to be okay. I never got that comfort from him. What I got instead was a lesson about what real strength actually looks like, and it had nothing to do with money, or company titles or 3-piece suits in a NICU. It had everything to do with a 5-pound baby girl who refused, every single day, to prove her grandfather right. If you've made it this far with me, I want to ask you something honestly, the same way I've been honest with you this entire story. What would you have done in my position? Would you have taken it to court the way we did, or handled it differently? I read every single comment on these videos, and I genuinely want to know your answer. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and hit that like button, because it genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to hear stories like Grace's. Subscribe to the Revenge Diaries if you want more true stories about ordinary people who found the strength to stand up against the people who were supposed to protect them. And if you know someone who's ever been made to feel like they weren't worth fighting for, send them this video, because sometimes the people we love most just need to hear that someone else understands exactly what they went through. Before you go, stick around, because I've got another story waiting for you. One about a woman who discovered her husband's family had been stealing from her for 15 years right under her nose, and what she did about it will absolutely stay with you. Grace is asleep upstairs as I finish telling you this story tonight. Dinosaur, stickers and all, 5 pounds of fight that grew into 90 pounds of proof that worth was never something anyone else got to decide for her. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.